Language is a kind of magic. Listening to someone speak to the highest consciousness in a room opens up a world totally inaccessible without language. It's as if words have the power to disclose a reality that wasn't there before. In the light of such language, we conceive of ourselves and the world in a new light. We see possibilities where there were none. We get in touch with parts of ourselves we had closed off. Similarly for speaking, saying it right can bring about a palpable sense of truth, just as failing to speak with care can create unease and disconnection. Often less is more. Often just a word or a few sentences delivered well with the right timing in the right rhythm can stop us in our tracks and return us to what's really happening. Language also establishes facts. If I say to you, it's time for dinner now, I establish a set of affairs between us which didn't exist before my saying these words. I created a kind of fact in the world through speaking. This is called speech-act theory, and philosophers have spent much time thinking about this, just as they have about many other ways and forms in which language acts on us and the world. The philosopher Martin Heidegger, who I was once quite obsessed with, for example, he spent the second half of his life primarily thinking about language. He was fascinated by what he called its world-disclosive properties, the way in which language enables a world, which for him meant disclosing a horizon of intelligibility within which we make sense of who we are, what matters, and how to act. Language, he said, is the house of being. Language is the house of being. It isn't we who are the masters of language, but rather language that is the masters of us. The limits of my language are always the limits of my world, wrote another philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, a little over 100 years ago. He followed this a few decades later with a famous and convincing argument to the effect that there is no such thing as my language, in the sense of having a private, self-contained language. Language is always a shared phenomenon. The words my language get their meaning from the way in which they make sense within a shared context. If we accept for a moment that language is a shared phenomenon and there is no my language, then what could we mean by our language? It's hard to generalize, of course, but at first approximation, our language feels more geared towards what separates us rather than what binds us together. Driven by the spectacular success of the empirical sciences since the Enlightenment, we've become obsessed with discovering what distinguishes one thing from another. The scientific method proceeds by studying things in isolation, separating them into parts and those parts into further parts. As a result, we're in the grips of the atomistic worldview, which prompted Walter Isaacson to observe that the atom, the bit, and the gene have become the three fundamental kernels of existence. Slowly but surely, we've modeled our understanding of what a human being is more to this model of the empirical sciences, and our language is beginning to reflect this. It wouldn't be so odd anymore if I advertised the breathwork session tomorrow afternoon by saying that it's likely to increase the oxygen saturation in your blood, which could lead to cellular regeneration and the elimination of free radicals in your system. Or during the nature walk, the serenity of the surroundings will bring the parasympathetic branch of your nervous system online, allowing you to downregulate your sympathetic response. Or that making new connections and having deep conversations during meals will release dopamine and serotonin, two neurotransmitters that make you happy, satisfied, and content. We understand ourselves as brains taking in and filtering information, and as nervous systems to be continually improved and optimized. There's nothing wrong with such analysis, and this way of looking at things can sometimes be helpful. But what it leaves out is the reality that we're human beings, and that carving us up into our scientific constituents makes us blind to the holistic phenomenon of being alive, of being conscious. It's kind of hot up here. What if the point of the breathing workshop is actually to breathe together? Humans from all over the world synchronizing their in and out breath, connecting with our sense of suffering and of joy. What if the whole thing was some kind of ritual? The ritual of slowing down and receiving your own breath, not needing to be intelligent about the outcome, just lying next to someone else who's being just as simple-minded as we are being. Perhaps the thing that heals us is not so much perfecting the right level of hormones in our blood, but rather dropping into the shared experience of simply being a breathing human being next to another. Perhaps the thing that heals us is the field. It's interesting that quantum mechanics, after dissecting everything into its fundamental components, into electrons, photons, and quarks, ends up pointing us back to the field. The wave-particle duality, quantum entanglement, the collapse of the wave function, they all point to the same thing, which is that at the most fundamental level, analysis of things at the level of isolated entities ceases to make sense. To make sense at that level, quantum mechanics must speak in terms of a whole, in terms of the relationship of things to each other, such that the structure of things becomes somehow more real than the things themselves. I feel like our language sometimes lacks this lesson from quantum mechanics. It lacks this last sentence that connects all the fragmented pieces back into the larger whole. If we only assign reality to that which we can measure and distinguish, we cut out something very important. And that which we cut out is that which cannot be broken apart. The sense of the whole, of the field, can only be known and experienced from a location different to that of our measuring devices. When we remain stuck at the level of fragmentation and separation, some other intelligence within us clocks this and starts to feel a longing to return to this unity we've forgotten. I think this longing forms the basis for a lot of the crisis language we're surrounded by. Isn't another feature of our current language this coming from brokenness, this coming from fragmentation? Many gatherings like these nowadays have an undertone of needing to fix something that is broken or recovering something that is lost. Addressing the environmental crisis, the social justice crisis, the meaning crisis, the poly crisis, the meta crisis. I'm wondering whether all these crises are rooted in a sense of language that has lost touch with the whole. So that maybe the way to proceed is not by fixing things, but by dissolving the setup that gave rise to the brokenness in the first place. Maybe what is required is more a liquefying, a softening, a dissolving. So how exactly does this work? I'm not sure, but personally I've found long periods of silence to be a good place to start. Tired of all those who come with words but no language, writes the Swedish poet Thomas Strandströmer. There is a language that can proceed without words. There is a way to be intimate with this world that opens up when we stop the compulsion to speak or act without first really listening. A sacred spaciousness unfolds. What a relief to have nothing to say, the right to say nothing, writes Deleuze, because only then is there a chance of finding the rare thing that might be worth saying. So what is really worth saying then? At the Alpine Fellowship, we consider ourselves to be a bit of a last stronghold for a certain kind of language that doesn't seem all that popular anymore these days. We champion lengthy and complicated poems, slightly obtuse ramblings, creative writing that comes from the heart, pieces of art that show boldness and courage, a philosophy whose concepts come from a long and arduous study of the human experience, music that demonstrates the love for the craft. We champion it because we think it is important to reward a kind of listening and sharing that goes beyond the techno-scientific model of wanting to enframe, capture, and store everything. There are two ways to use language. One is language as a tool to fix something, to lock something in. Another is language as a way of letting be, of opening up, of bringing forth. There is no news in poetry, wrote Williams Carlius Williams, but men die every day for a lack of what is written there. That is the language of the Alpine Fellowship. And that is why the arts matter. Because at the end of the day, there's nothing to do here but to bow down to the infinite grace and immensity and mystery of the fact that we are. The universal at the heart cannot be grasped or seized or enframed or calculated. The universe at the heart is not a thing, and what's most intimate can never be quantified. The words of true language often come out of thin air. We literally pluck them like ripe apples on an orchard in springtime. The poet Neruda writes, "Now we will count to 12, and we will all keep still for once on the face of the earth. Let's not speak in any language. Let's stop for a second and not move our arms so much." If we were not so single-minded about keeping our lives moving, and for once could do nothing, perhaps a huge silence might interrupt the sadness of never understanding ourselves. Perhaps the earth can teach us as when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive. Thank you.
I think, therefore I am, was ever a more harmful phrase uttered in the history of philosophy. Not least was Descartes, by all accounts, a cruel man, but these words have always bothered me. It gives rise to the dubious notion that thinking is primary and that existing is predicative. Descartes apparently thought animals could not feel pain. Their inability to announce their private lexicon to our species, or our inability to hear them, forces a bunch of conclusions about their consciousness and their private lives. Language, it seems, plays a pivotal role in the conclusions we make about consciousness. When I utter, "I think," who exactly am I referring to? Of course, I've been schooled, as most of us have, to accept a version of the Cartesian world and to reinforce it through language. Whenever I ask Jacob, "How are you?" I demonstrate my ignorance or reinforce my obedience to that view. Because I believe that asking, "How is Jacob?" is rather like asking, "How is India?" Which bit? When? In relation to what? The question only works if I assume Jacob to be extremely limited ontologically and in his relation to me in the world, like a bowl of soup, for example. How's the soup? Even soup requires better questioning. It might not just be good or too hot, but too wet or, frankly, inappropriate. The soup prompts questions in relation to the world, its particular place, and its particular makeup. But we, I think, are more than soup. A being, be that Jacob or me or you or my pet dog, have somewhat larger and more porous senses of self. So when we claim, "I think," what do we really mean by this I? And how helpful or unhelpful is language in our pursuit of representing us and understanding our worlds? Of course, I know I'm being slightly ridiculous. Language needs to simplify categories in order to allow the basic transactions of information. "How are you, Jacob?" is traditionally answered with, "I'm well," or nowadays we offer the moral response of "I'm good." The answer basically gives us a vague running average of everything from health to relationships to work satisfaction. But perhaps it gives us an indication of where language is and where we are. "How are you?" is really me asking if there is anything big enough in your private life that prevents our mutual work proceeding. Unless you disclose some catastrophe, the procedure is to ignore the answer and drop into the automatic business of whatever it is we're mutually doing. Of course, it's not always the case. Intonation, touch, body language can demonstrate if we are asking, "How are you?" in a significant way. But typically, the phrase has lost all of that meaning. It is essentially asking if we can proceed. Language in the self gets even more complex. He and his were for a long time considered gender neutral. I have a quote which I thought was funny. "Everyone will be able to decide for himself whether or not to have an abortion." Doesn't seem to work. Each employee must sign the register when she/he enters or leaves. Maybe works a bit better. Unless, of course, that self doesn't identify with those categories on gender grounds. They, them are non-gendered pronouns, embraced by some, despised by others. But whilst the gender status of the pronoun may be significant, the adoption of pronouns doesn't yet directly speak to the confusing ontological status of the proper noun itself. Sure, I may be he, him, and you may be they, them. And now we're perhaps somewhat clearer on gender. But what of the original Cartesian sin we recommit? Let us imagine for a second dear Jacob returns from months in silent retreat, where in time he sees the impermanence of all being. Self is not separate from surroundings. He is, shall we say, radiantly interconnected to the world. And then I shout at him, "Hey dude, how are you?" Every iteration of he, him, you, what did you do, where are you going, how do you feel, what's your problem, quietly, to my mind, reestablishes the myth of the isolated mind, that he is separate. And once and again, the world becomes a series of objects for a subject to act upon, a lonely ghost in a machine. Okay, so this is quite esoteric, but for the materialists in the room, I think the problem endures. We are outnumbered in our bodies by entirely alien creatures. Scientists suggest only 43% of my cells are human, and the rest are microscopic colonists, bacteria, viruses, fungi. Somehow, over time, this collection of human cells has acquired a migrant labor force, outnumbering the human cells. Colonies of entirely foreign creatures coexist, and the extent to which they govern both the functions of my digestion, my decision-making, and my sense of self are currently one of the big questions of today. Perhaps the other colonists were there from day one. Perhaps the I was always conditional on the collaboration of species, and yet somehow this collaborative power share was forgotten. The point is that to call myself human, I think, is analogous to calling Britain white or Christian. I, it appears, am not an I, but a we, and a multicultural, multi-species we. And so the truth appears to be that the proper noun, which you refer to when you say, "Hello, Alan," is indeed best served by pronouns they, them. And more so, it's not just that the I is a we, but this point of view itself does not have a clear point of origin. Sure, I loosely associate with this body. I feel pain. I want these cells to continue to live. But as I pedantically noun myself, I diminish an incredible adjectival and verbal identity that shifts like a river that is colored by the world. Most of the time, of course, I drive the machine in a bored, automatic, Cartesian manner, conditioned as I am by language and other language users. But when we stop thinking, and I think this is the point, when we stop thinking, we do not cease to be. The am is very much here and everywhere without the I think. It's hard to talk about this because our language demands certain metaphysics. Poetry is perhaps our best hope. There's a legendary rock climber, Johnny Dawes, you may or may not know about. he talks about waiting for the climb to let you know when the moment is right. You don't decide, it decides, and in an odd, non-verbal way, tells you. When we stop the exhausting task of trying to direct operations, when we let the I dissolve like an effervescent lozenge, the world can be heard. And in those moments, things happen with us. I'd like to finish with something from our dear friend John Burnside. These are the final lines from his collection Black Cat Bone, and somehow they express what I'm trying to say. This is the time of year when nothing to see gives way to the hare in flight, the enormous beauty of it stark against the mud and thawglass on the track before it darts away across the open fields and leaves me dumbstruck, ready to be persuaded. Thank you.